faithfully conveying value, interpreting great books from around the world. Hello, this is Sally Book Talk. Today I'll interpret the book The Death of Wang Shi for you. Its author is the renowned American sinologist Jonathan Spence, whose Chinese name is Shi Jingqian. In the U.S., Shi Jingqian, along with Philip Kuhn of Harvard University and Frederick Wakeman of UC Berkeley, are known as the three giants of sinology. Shi Jingqian primarily studies the history of the Ming and Qing dynasties and contemporary China. Today's book, The Death of Wang Shi, is one of his representative works. And Wang Shi, in the book title, was an ordinary woman living in Tancheng County, Shandong, during the late Ming and early Qing period. She and her husband, Ren, were dirt poor and had a strained relationship with her father-in-law. One day, in 1671, unable to bear it any longer, Wang Shi eloped with someone. Unfortunately, while still on the way, Wang Shi was abandoned by her lover. She had no choice but to return to her husband, Ren, and they lived together for a few more months. In January 1672, on a snowy and windy night, Wang Shi had an argument with her husband. That night, while Wang Shi was asleep, her husband strangled her to death and dumped her body in the snow. Shi Jingqian stumbled upon this insignificant little event in the library and used it as a starting point to write a whole book. The book has 6 chapters, and only the last 2 deal with Wang Shi's death. In the preface of this book, Shi Jingqian says that his focus is on the local non-intellectual elite, namely the farmers, farm laborers, and their wives. He starts with the stories of ordinary people, vividly portraying the social ecology of rural Shandong during the late Ming and early Qing period. Now, let's follow Shi Jingqian's narrative. First, let's learn about the historical Tancheng County. It's located in the southernmost part of Shandong and is under the jurisdiction of Linyi City. During the late Ming and early Qing period, this place was utterly poor and destitute. There are 3 main reasons for the poverty. First, the natural conditions were poor. Tancheng is an agricultural county. The main crops are wheat and sorghum, but most of the land is mountainous, with rugged terrain that's not conducive to farming, and natural disasters are frequent. In most places in China, local records show that the number of disasters and auspicious signs, meaning natural calamities and beneficial natural phenomena, are roughly equal. But in Tancheng, 9 out of 10 matters in local governance were related to disasters. At the beginning of the book, Shi Jingqian describes a major earthquake. On July 25, 1668, which was the 7th year of the Kangxi reign in the Qing dynasty, an 8.5 magnitude earthquake struck Tancheng, causing approximately 50,000 deaths. That night of the earthquake, huge cracks appeared in the ground of Tancheng, running under roads and houses. Groundwater gushed out in massive jets, at least 5 or 6 meters high. One family's house was split in half by the quake, and the storage room fell into a crack. Because the earthquake happened at night, the family was mostly resting in the living room. So they narrowly escaped disaster, but most people weren't so lucky. Another family of 29 had only 3 survivors. After the earthquake ended, the collapsed rubble piled up where the ground had sunk, looking like giant steps. Besides that, in just 10 years, from 1649 to 1659, during the Shunji era of the Qing dynasty, Tancheng County experienced floods 5 times. And massive amounts of river water flooded the fields, so the county magistrate had to patrol the town by boat. And after a locust plague, just before Qingming in 1640, Tancheng County had a complete crop failure. A great famine came, and tragic scenes of cannibalism frequently occurred between fathers and sons, brothers and husbands and wives. Even the closest friends no longer dared to go out together, fearing they might be killed and eaten by each other. This is the first reason that led to Tancheng County's poverty. Because the natural conditions were so poor, This place often suffered major disasters, and in some years, there wasn't even a single grain harvested. The second reason to be discussed next is taxes, which worsened the local people's economic situation. The taxes on the people of Tanchang were countless. First, there were the land tax and the poll tax. The land tax is levied based on standards like land area, price, and yield. The poll tax is a tax collected based on the number of adult males. These were the main fixed taxes at the time and the primary source of government revenue everywhere. Because they were so poor, the farmers in Tanchang couldn't pay all their taxes at once, so the local government allowed them to pay in installments over 9 months. Even so, by the 9th year of the Kangxi era in the Qing dynasty, which is 1670, Tanchang had already been in arrears on taxes for 13 consecutive years. Additionally, able-bodied men in Tanchang County had to perform corvée labor. If they didn't want to go, they had to pay extra money instead. Land tax, poll tax, these were considered regular taxes. Tanchang's geographical location meant that the local people also had to bear some special taxes. For example, Tanchang was located on the necessary route to southern regions like Zhejiang and Fujian, serving as a key hub for transporting military supplies and conveying important messages. The locality was responsible for many special services related to this, like maintaining roads, ensuring transport, and accommodating passing officials and their entourages. The costs incurred ultimately had to be paid by the common people. So, how much money was that roughly? According to the registration records at the time, the local land tax plus poll tax collected in Tanchang in a year totaled about 14,000 taels of silver. And for the special services mentioned above, the government had to pay at least 3,300 taels of silver annually, accounting for nearly a quarter of the regular tax revenue. Additionally, taxes had to be paid for activities like peddlers opening pawn shops, real estate transactions, and salt trading. Since silver is made of precious metal and easy to preserve value, from the Ming Dynasty onward, the government mandated that taxes be paid in silver. Ordinary people had to convert their copper coins into legally pure silver. In this process, they also had to pay what was called the melting fee, which was mainly used to compensate for the loss incurred during the high-temperature melting and casting of silver. Some taxes were also paid in the form of goods, such as people having to hand over some of their possessions to the authorities as tribute to the emperor without compensation. This was equivalent to paying extra money indirectly. With so many taxes to pay, it was a heavy burden for both taxpayers and tax collectors. However, some powerful landlords and gentry had connections higher up, so they could delay paying taxes, and the authorities didn't dare to press them. These landlords and gentry also established balan relationships with some farmers. That is, farmers transferred their land under the names of these connected landlords and gentry, so they could pay less tax or be exempt from some corvée labor in return. The farmers would then run errands and do tasks for these landlords and gentry. Compared to the taxes they saved, this effort was still worthwhile. Over time, half of the farmers in Tanchang County established such balan relationships with landlords. Those who couldn't find such connections fled.
Those who stayed had to pay more taxes, often reaching 10 or even 20 times the stipulated amount.
Once, someone reported this illegal balan practice and found witnesses. As a result, the landlords sent people to threaten the witnesses and even broke the reporter's leg. The case ultimately came to nothing. The local magistrate of Tanchang also thought about taxing merchants more to alleviate the burden on farmers. But the results weren't ideal, because merchants were highly mobile, making tax collection troublesome, and they also had connections higher up. A small magistrate couldn't handle it at all, and 70%, dead path. The third reason for Tianjin's poverty was continuous warfare and bandit raids. During the late Ming and early Qing period, warfare occurred frequently in Tanchang. The first major conflict described in the book is the White Lotus Rebellion of 1622. That year, followers of the White Lotus sect rebelled in Shandong. The leader claimed he could take everyone to a wonderful world without worries of food or clothing, filled with countless treasures. Many people, unable to endure the pain of real life, believed this and joined the rebellion. As a result, most followers died violently, and many innocent people also perished in this uprising, including many people from Tanchang. An even more formidable force was the Qing army. They were regular troops, so they were also more ferocious.
In 1643, a Qing army unit rushed to the Tanchang area to plunder and quickly occupied the county town.
They killed tens of thousands locally, and corpses were strewn all over the streets. It was impossible to walk without stepping on bodies. However, the Qing army hadn't officially entered the pass yet. Later in 1644, when the Qing army marched south again to conquer, the people of Tanchang, ravaged by disasters and war, had no ability to resist at all. So much so that official histories barely describe the locals' reaction to the Qing invasion, only mentioning that under the leadership of a provincial scholar, they came out from behind the city walls and surrendered to the Qing army. In Tanchang, bandit raids were also commonplace. In April 1641, a band of thousands of bandits attacked Tanchang. Although many people hid in their homes, they were still hacked to death or burned alive by the bandits. Fortunately, under the leadership of a veteran, the locals quickly organized to fight the bandits and save the county town. After plundering the suburbs, the bandits finally left. The same scenario was repeated many times later, and many people died tragically as a result. Those who miraculously survived wanted to find their dead relatives and give them a proper burial, but even this was impossible. Because among piles of corpses, they couldn't recognize their own relatives. They could only make rough judgments based on clothing or simply bury the bodies collectively and be done with it. In such an environment, the local population plummeted. Around 1620, Tanchang's population was over 200,000, but by around 1670, it was only about 60,000. Our protagonists, Wang Shi and her husband Ren, though they survived, really had a hard life. They lived in a small village about 20 kilometers southwest of Tanchang County. The walls of Wang Shi's house were made of rammed earth, mud bricks, and sorghum stalks plastered together. The pillars were made of a few twisted tree branches, and the roof was covered only with a thin layer of grass and reeds, completely unable to keep out wind and rain. There's only one room in the house, containing a cooking pot, a lamp, a woven sleeping mat, and a straw mattress. The family's sole income came from Ren, working as a hired hand in others' fields. Such destitute, hand-to-mouth living fostered a local culture that glorified violence. Survival meant ruthlessly competing for limited resources. The book recounts a true story. A wealthy landlord surnamed Wang and his son killed 4 neighbors, a father and his 3 sons, just because their pig wandered into Wang's field. Spence wrote that the Wangs killed without hesitation, striking viciously, piercing hearts or slashing throats for instant kills.
They then led armed resistance against arrest, fearlessly spearing an officer in the chest, terrifying troops until authorities finally captured them with great effort.
Under contemporary law, Wang's property should have compensated the victims' families, but officials feared confiscating the property due to the Wangs' ferocity, leaving the families destitute and bereaved. To underscore how normalized violence was, Spence references Kuimang's story from Strange Tales from a Chinese Studio. Its author Pu Songling lived during the same late Ming, early Qing era, mostly in Sichuan County bordering Tanchang. Both regions shared similar social conditions.
Thus, Spence argues Strange Tales accurately reflects Tanqing's social atmosphere and popular mentality at the time.
Here's Queen Meng's story. The protagonist, from an official family, had a fiery temper and believed in violence. At school, if classmates slightly offended him, he'd immediately throw punches. So his teacher named him Kui Meng, Fierce Kui. Kui loved fighting injustice, instantly brawling with wrongdoers he encountered. When a neighbor's wife abused her mother-in-law, Kui cut off her ears, nose, and tongue. She died quickly. Later, when a man named Li Shen's wife was seized by a local tyrant who beat him brutally, Kui killed the tyrant and gutted him. Eventually, after turning herself in, Kui was exiled to Yunnan. Post-exile, he and Li Shen became close friends. After the Qing dynasty was established, the two continued fighting injustice. They destroyed a bandit den and cut off the noses of over 20 captured bandits. They also formed a self-defense militia. Becoming widely known, people came to join Xi Jinping, pointing out that the Wang father-son story was likely the real-life inspiration for Kui Meng's tale. These two stories show that, whether in fiction or reality, survival in Tanchangben depended on brute strength. In such an environment, women like Wang Shi had even narrower space to survive. On one hand, aside from rare jobs like midwifery, they had no way to earn money and couldn't achieve financial independence. On the other hand, they were morally required to be chaste and faithful women, unconditionally loyal to their husbands, even at the cost of their lives. Here, Xi Jingchan cites another story from Strange Tales called Yun Kujan. The protagonist, Yun Krishan, is a young and beautiful woman. Once, while visiting a temple to burn incense with her mother, she caught the eye of a man named Liang Yuchai. Liang Yuchai knew how to flatter, won over Yun Krishan's mother, and married Yun. But Liang was a penniless rogue who spent all day drinking and gambling. After marriage, they only had basic sustenance through support from Yun's family, yet he kept drinking and gambling with other riffraff. When money ran out, he stole Yun's jewelry to fund his bets, and finally, egged on my gambling buddies. He planned to sell Yun to a brothel to get more gambling money, leaving Yun furious. At the story's end, Yun Krishan reveals her true identity. Turns out she was a thousand-year fox spirit who came to the human world, hoping to find a good husband and live peacefully. But meeting this scoundrel, after bitterly denouncing Liang's heartlessness, she rode the wind away. Without this mythical ending, the plot reflects the real plight of women then, completely powerless in marriage, unable to choose new lives, even with thoroughly awful husbands. And Spence writes in the book, what could Tanching women without magic or money do? But even with property, women had no control over their fates. The book tells of a widow surnamed Pang. Her husband left her some money, land, a house, and an ox. Pang faithfully fulfilled her widow's duties, sending her son Chen Lian to study, hoping he'd eventually continue the family lineage. But Chen Lian was killed by his cousin Chen Guoxian, because the law at the time stated that if a wealthy woman's husband and son both died, the clan leader could select a suitable candidate from the clan to be adopted as heir and inherit the property. And in the Chen family, if Chen Lian died, Chen Guoxian and his two brothers were the most qualified to inherit the estate. The problem was how to kill Chen Lian without getting sentenced to death. Then Chen Guoxiang noticed another law. A son committing murder to avenge his parents wasn't considered a crime. So Chen Guoxiang fabricated a story claiming Chen Lian's father had killed his own father. As a filial son, he naturally had to avenge his dad. But the actual killer was already dead. So he applied the debts of the father fall to the son principle to target the killer's son for revenge. Thus, Chen Guoxiang dragged Chen Lian into a temple in broad daylight and beat him to death with a large wooden club. And afterward, he swaggered to surrender himself, but he'd misread the law, because the law's intent was to excuse immediate acts of vengeance, not delayed ones. Chen Guoxiang's revenge happened 27 years after his father's death, and the law didn't recognize father-son debt transfer. So he was ultimately sentenced to death. For Madame Peng, though, her biological son was dead. The clan leader selected a distant relative to become her adopted son. She still had to watch her family property pass to an outsider.
Throughout this, neither law, custom, nor her husband's clan stood by Madame Peng.
Merely because of her gender, she lost inheritance rights and spent her life dependent on her husband's clan.
Hearing this, we now understand the social backdrop of Wang Shi's death. Extreme poverty, rampant violence, and women trapped with no autonomy. Back to Wang Shi. Even if dissatisfied with marriage, she couldn't leave freely unless severely beaten by her husband, or maimed, or forced into relations with others. After eloping, Wang Shi had broken the law. If caught, she'd face at least 90 heavy cane strikes. Worse still, her lover abandoned her on the journey. Childless and seemingly orphaned, she had no nearby relatives to turn to. So, despite being terrified, she still had to choose to go home because she had no foundation for independent living. The book doesn't explain why we accepted his wife, but they continued living together for a few more months. One day in January 1672, with snow falling outside, they quarreled over trivial matters. Ren waited until Wang Shi fell asleep and strangled her to death on the bed. Ren carried Wang Shi's body through the forest, intending to dump it at the door of his neighbor, Gao. Ren had previously argued with Gao, and he planned to frame Gao by accusing him of having an affair with Wang Shi. But on the way, he startled a dog and a night watchman, so he just dumped Wang Shi's body in the snow. The next day, the body was discovered, and authorities quickly identified Ren as the suspect. Ren confessed. By common sense, Ren killed first and framed later, so he should be sentenced to death regardless. However, the county magistrate believed that since Wang Shi betrayed him first, Ren killing her was somewhat excusable. Also, Ren was an only child and had no children of his own. If he were executed, their family lineage would be cut off. Therefore, the magistrate didn't sentence Ren to death, but ordered him to be severely beaten and to wear a kongu. At that time, wearing a kamge was a great humiliation. The magistrate felt this was already a form of punishment for Ren killing Wang Shi. And if Ren died from being beaten too severely while wearing the kangwei, it would count as him paying with his life for the murder. If he survived, he could find another woman to marry and continue his family lineage. Finally, the magistrate allocated 10 taels of silver to prepare a good coffin for Wang Shi and buried her near her home to appease her vengeful spirit. With this, the main content of Wang Shi's death is concluded. This is a historical narrative with a novelistic style. In writing this book, Shi Jingchan mainly used 3 sources. The first source is called the Tanchen County Gazetter. It was compiled by a man named Fen Ketchen. He had served as the magistrate of Tancheng. The gazetteer is an official document recording local information such as geography, land, tax systems, etc., and also records major events like disasters. It truthfully reflects the hardships of the local people in Tancheng. The second source is the Fu Hui Quanshu. The author of this book is Huang Lu Hong, who also served as the magistrate of Tancheng. Fu Hui Quanshu is his personal notes or memoir. He wrote this book to show through personal experience how to avoid losing one's official position. So Huang Lu Hong introduced many notorious and difficult to handle cases as exemplary demonstrations, all highly typical and memorable. For instance, both Wang Shi's death story and the Wang father-son story, killing neighbors and resisting arrest, are recorded in this book. The first 2 sources are materials historians typically reference. The third material Spence used was strange tales from a Chinese studio. This distinguishes Wang Shi's death from traditional historical works and draws criticism. Since Strange Tales is fictional, critics say Wang Shi's death lacks rigor and violates historical scholarship norms. Additionally, Spence simply tells stories without demonstrating research depth. Prominent modern Chinese historian Wang Ramzu felt Spence's works, while numerous, prioritized captivating stories over solid historical knowledge. Some even argue Spence's works are fundamentally novels, not historical scholarship. Qian Zhongshu, renowned scholar and author of Fortress Besieged, once called Spence a failed novelist. But Spence actually adhered to a historian's core principle, letting historical sources speak.
His works contain extensive annotations citing all material sources.
Yet no material can record all historical truths. For historical gaps, Spence believed reasonable imagination and novelistic narrative could fill them. This represents a perspective. He meant novel writing stems from lived reality, reflecting the creator's perceived era and environment. Lian Chao held similar views. In his Methods for Chinese Historical Research, he stated novels inevitably reflect their social context, unconsciously capturing an era's background. Spence also cited ancient Chinese historians' practices. He noted they created dialogues for key figures, even when unrecorded. For these historians, fabricated dialogue was a tool to intensify character interactions and invite readers into their minds. This unconventional approach is what makes Spence's work unique, opening a door for ordinary Western readers to understand Chinese history. For general Western readers, there are quite a few academic books available about China, but these books are often too abstruse. Just the unfamiliar place names, personal names, and events can be overwhelming. Spence, however, with his elegant and fluid writing, pulls readers into specific historical contexts, making historical figures vivid and relatable. This deserves recognition. Professor Wang Jiafan from East China Normal University's History Department said this book shows people that history can be written this way, in such a form. For modern Chinese historical writing that tends to be rigid and self-satisfied, it serves as a highly motivating, well-intentioned warning. All right, that concludes our interpretation of The Death of Wang Shi. Reading notes are below the audio. See you next time.